notebook here. Specifically around education, we're looking at what are some of the key factors to bear in mind when dealing with children and education. And we're going to look at some of those issues specifically in China, India, and 60 other countries. And also, I guess looking at the audience here from an investment standpoint, we're talking about specifically making investments and interventions, and where should we be investing? Education is of prime importance. There's a strong correlation between poor quality education and poverty. Some of the numbers that were mentioned even this morning, about 4 billion people still living in poverty, but I think it was important to highlight in 1981, China had 43% of its population living below the poverty line, less than $1.25. India had 60% of its population living below the poverty line, and the rest of South Asia had 32% of its population living below the poverty line. 30 years down the road, where are we? In 2013, India still has 33% of its population living on less than $1.25 a day. While that number, the percentage has come down, it's barely kept at pace with the double-digit growth rate. So we're still talking about 450 million people in India still living below the poverty line. And South Asia, surprisingly, is only 32% in 1981, 42% living below the poverty line. China has done something dramatic. It's moved from 43% in 1981 down to 13% in 2013. A large driving factor for that has been its investment in education and what it's done. Specifically, if you look at what Shanghai achieved in PISA, some of the other Chinese countries that have achieved high results in PISA, I think there's a strong investment that China is making in education, specifically looking at how it can have employable skills. Before I hand over to the panelists, we want to share a little bit small experience about what we have as an organization. I represent an organization called ARC, Absolute Return for Kids. We're a UK-based philanthropic cooperative. We've been working in India for the last 5 years, and we focus in various domains around access and quality and school quality assessments. Now looking to run our own schools in India along sort of the private-public partnership model. But just a experience that I'd like to share in a very large state in India. We were funded by DFID to conduct a study around keeping the girl child, the secondary school girl child in school. And so we're talking about grade 8 school girl children to be kept in school for grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. And what DFID and the state government were keen to look at was an incentive that we could provide to the girl child or her family to stay in school. So when we conducted this study, we spoke to 400 families across 3 districts in this state, second largest state in India. And we offered them various sort of categories of investments, ranging from school fees to uniforms to transportation, subsidies on household expenditure, in-kind subsidies, and then kind of tallied the results and said, what's the number at which you could tip the number of girls that actually would continue to stay in school? What we found was a very startling sort of fact that came out not only for us but also for the state government, which was that greater than 50% of the families were not willing to accept any incentive at any price point till such time they were assured quality. Now that's huge. If you were to offer somebody 10,000 rupees and for 4 years, that's a significant amount of money for a household that's living on less than $1.25 a day. But they were not willing to do it because they had kept their girl child in school for 8 years, and this girl child was unable to write her name or read a simple class 2 text at the end of 8 years of school. So the point I'm making here is that the parents are not going to accept this any longer. In our experience, when we went back to the Madhya Pradesh government, we said, you cannot bribe a parent to stay in school, and you cannot show that you have high enrollment levels when you're failing the poor person on the street. Unfortunately, there is no definition for quality. What is quality? Is it good results, or is it a clean toilet, or is it clean drinking water, or is it painted walls, or is it teacher attendance? There's no definition. At least in the Indian context, there wasn't one at that point in time. So when we came back as an organization with this starting fact, we said one of the things you could put in place is a benchmark of quality. So in our UK experience, having worked very closely with Ofsted, where there are inspections of schools, we said why not contextualize a similar process for the state and be able to put a framework whereby you have a benchmark of quality schools in the state, both government and private, across all categories of school, high end, low end, or free, and define what quality means. So we've been doing that for the last 7-8 months, where we've put a framework in place. We're now working with about 100 odd schools to demonstrate that, with the hope that at the end of this year, the government is now going to replicate that across 150,000 schools in the state. So I just think it's a great partnership, again talking about private and government, bringing in sort of philanthropic capital to invest with a larger goal in mind so that you can have systemic impact. But I'm hoping that this is kind of a good segue into the panelists sharing a little bit more on their experiences. So we'll start with Kristen.
Sure. So as I mentioned this morning, if you were in the room then, I think you'll have a sense of some of the work that I'm about to describe really originating from local organizations and local institutions. But here I'll talk about the work that we're investing in that is focused on education. And at the Global Fund for Children, not surprisingly, 72% of all of our investments are education facing in some fashion. It might be, the second stage after, rescue from trafficking. It might be the kind of primary purpose of the organization, but it is clearly a huge part of our work for all of the reasons that all of us already know. I think in considering this presentation, I thought about a couple of things. What for us are the hallmarks of what makes for a successful education intervention? And the flip side is what makes for a successful education institution, because we're investing ultimately in the institution. So I'll talk about three things. One is context, the second is quality, so I appreciated that, and the third is sustainability. And so for us, context is really rooted in a couple of things. I've got on my slide there exclusion, disruption, and poverty. And so when we're talking about serving children, for the most part, the market has written off. So again, I'm talking about families and communities at the bottom of the pyramid, and in 62 countries, that looks different everywhere, but ultimately, it's typically one of these three things that is at the core of it. So exclusion for us is typically something that means that ethnic minorities or girls, in many places, are completely excluded from the education system. So one of my most recent site visits was to China, so it was interesting to hear your reference to the China education system. And while it works for many and improvement has been tremendous, one of the things that's also true is that the hukou system keeps a lot of children from adequate education. So that's a system that, whereby you're registered in a rural community, and if your family moves to the city, because that's where the economic opportunity is, they're trying to create a better life for you, you find that your children are completely excluded from any educational opportunity, or you have the opportunity to pay for education. And so understanding the dynamics of the place, ultimately when I'm talking about context, I'm referring to kind of understanding all of the pieces of the puzzle that affect whether or not children have access and whether or not quality is provided. So, for us, understanding how these factors work in every country where we work is related to why we work with local institutions, because local institutions understand the dynamics of exclusion. So in some places it's hukou. In other places like Laos, for example, we supported one of the only programs that was enabling indigenous language school book production. So there was an entire segment of the population that was written off because their language and the language of instruction were different. And one of those two things had to change, right? Though there's plenty of research that says that mother tongue language instruction is far more effective in solving education and delivering quality than not. So, knowing what the exclusion factors are is one piece of the puzzle for us. I think the second piece for us is disruption. And one of the things that was interesting to me as I've been kind of getting more and more into this work is that 42% of the time children are out of school because of war or conflict. And so there are places where the question of kind of quality and education and teachers and books is moot, because what is disrupting their access to learning is war and conflict that keeps them from being safe, that destroys the local institutions, that takes out the teaching workforce. And so knowing how work can be delivered successfully in that context is something that a lot of our partners have done. So I was with a grantee partner in our work. I don't know if this is odd or not, but we include Afghanistan in our sweep of Asia from west to east. And I was with one of our partners who created a series of schools, and in every place that they created the school strategy, it looked a little different. It started off as schools in refugee camps on the Pakistan side of the border. And that had to look a certain way. That had to be kind of a model curriculum where you could have kind of classrooms for every grade level, teachers for every grade level, and kind of a regular curriculum of instruction. Then they went into delivering education on the Afghan side of the border, and when she started, the schools were secret, which meant that they were convening in people's houses, and that the teachers were not trained teachers, and that every class, from the very young children to older children, were all under one roof. And so the system of education had to change to adapt to that local context. And then they've gone on to create kind of freestanding community institutions where mothers and children are learning together. And so kind of figuring out how you deliver education in a context that is conflict-ridden and also complicated, and how that looks in different arenas is something that was important to her. The other place we've done a lot of work in this space is in Thailand, right across from the Burma border in Chiang Mai, where we've supported a lot of work for children who came from one side of the border to the other, and found obviously that the Thai government was not inclined to recognize or educate. So there's a lot of places where exclusion and conflict are keeping children out of education in that way. And then the last thing that was already mentioned was poverty. And so, kind of what are the things that are keeping children from being educated? For us, and one of the projects I think in the picture there is a group that we support called Jago in Bangladesh. And, their insight is this, that parents obviously cannot keep their families at subsistence level if their children aren't working beside them in the market. So how do you disrupt that system, create an incentive for parents to send their children to school instead of having them working? And the school project that we've worked with has created micro enterprise that allows parents to basically buy the freedom of their children to be educated. I mention all of these examples only for the following reason, that in each of those places you couldn't pick up that model and drop it somewhere else and have it be successful. And so understanding what's going to work locally, what the dynamics are that are keeping children from education, and then spawning that activity from within to grow it and scale it is part of what our measure of success in an education program looks like. I think the second piece that I would want to mention that was referred to already was quality. And so, there's a lot of schools of thought that kind of basic literacy is enough, getting books to kids and helping them read is a transformational experience, but it's not enough. So even the woman that was doing the schools in refugee camps and in homes was very committed to quality education. And for us, that means a couple of things. It means tracking whether or not programs are trending, tracking, and progressing students from informal. So wherever they start, it might be a very informal program on a training platform in India. But the end game is to get children to successfully compete in a formal learning environment. And so knowing how they plan to do that, tracking that performance, is something that we've not only done within standalone programs, but we've been able to spread across various programs. The curriculum development is another kind of mechanism for a lot of our investments. So creating a curriculum, whether it's in the right language or whether it's adapting Montessori principles, which is something that happens a lot in our projects, and enabling teachers to use that effectively is a second way we're measuring and implementing quality. I think teacher training, and so the Cartwheel program, which is in the Philippines, that you see is in an area that has for a long time been subject to conflict, war, and is now in this recovery mechanism where teachers have to be trained, the language is indigenous, and so kind of creating local school clusters that are going to be effective in that region, and training the teachers is another piece that we've done. And then the last bit is location. And a lot of our education programs are about bringing education to children and not children to education, because that's simply the necessity. So whether that's a mobile creche set up on a construction site, which happens a lot, or the schools that are on boats that I mentioned before, but understanding that every system is not going to work if it requires a child to get to a building. But you still have to get quality education in that mobile setting is another thing that cuts across our programs. And then the last bit that I'll mention just really quickly is, and you heard this earlier from me, that sustainability is the real end game. And so all of our investments start locally because the people started them are going to be there after our investment is over with. We make long-term 5 to 6 year investments, and that's a minimum amount of time to really make change and achieve this kind of work that we've talked about. And then I'm not going to really speak to scalability because we've talked about that a lot. But one of the things that I'm really pleased with that we do is typically bringing our grantees together so that they can swap and share and learn both their curriculum, their methodology, and other things that would accelerate others. And so, one of the things that happened with the boat school was that moved from Bangladesh to Central Africa. One of the things that's happening now is that we've got a group in Cairo that has a whole Montessori curriculum that it uses in slum schools outside of Cairo Central District. And that's a program that's been migrated to Tanzania. And so bringing people together also allows for the acceleration and spread of these interventions in a way that I think is useful. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Azad Uman. I'm the Executive Director of the Central Square Foundation, which is a venture philanthropy fund that's based out of Delhi in India. We're only a year old, so we're learning a lot about the field of education. We really wanted to take, we didn't come into it with preconceived notions. We were trying to understand what another foundation in India that was focused on education could do. And one of the things we quickly realized was that the debate in the last, the discussion in the last 10 years in India had moved from one around access to one around quality. So what today almost more than 90% of children in India are enrolled in school at some point, whether it's in kindergarten or they come in later, but at some point they enter a school. And the sad thing is that less than 30% of them actually finish 12th grade. So there's a huge dropout problem that exists along the continuum of education. And we believe that primarily that is because it's the quality within the Indian education system is really poor. So there's no incentive for children to stay in school and not to go and help their family with their income or whatever other reasons they drop out of school. So some of the surveys that have been done around Indian education demonstrate that by 5th grade, over 50% of children are not able to read at a 2nd grade level or do simple division. So if you think about it at 5th grade, if there's such a large gap already, then by the time you hit 8th grade, and when you start getting more specialized in subjects, more and more children start to drop out. So I thought what might be useful was to just talk a little bit about how we think about venture philanthropy and taking this venture philanthropy approach and applying it to education. So I think the first is that we invest in, I guess innovation after this morning may not be the best word to use, but the essential thing is to invest in ideas that have scalable potential. So we find that when one looks at India, there's, depending on the numbers you believe, there's anywhere between 100 and 400,000 NGOs in India. Many of them claim to have education as part of their focus. But if you're looking for organizations that are credible, where entrepreneurs who have a vision and the systems within the organization to invest in, there's a very small number of investable opportunities. So one of the things that we're doing is actually trying to encourage entrepreneurship within the education space, particularly as it focuses on children from marginalized communities. I think the second thing that we try and do is we provide, not only do we provide the financial capital, but what I think this has been echoed by some of the other people earlier today, that what we find really interesting is that what many of these NGOs really need more, in addition to the money, is intellectual and social capital. And by that what I mean is many of them don't have the the understanding of management processes that would allow them to sustain, that would allow them to scale. And also many of them are small organizations that are not really connected to the larger debates around education. And so how do you as an organization that's working in a small community in, say, Mumbai, how do you connect to the national discussions around education, and how do you have a voice at that table? Which leads me to my next point around creating a nurturing ecosystem. So that we find is that there really are very few places for people to convene. So for instance, I live in Mumbai, and there's probably about 8 to 10 organizations that are doing really good work on education. And they almost, I mean, I've been there for 2 years, and in my 2 years, they've never come together to discuss what they're doing from, stepping out of their day-to-day work and discussing it on a more systemic level. So I think, as a funder, we feel like it's really important to create that kind of ecosystem, so we're working on that. I think the other thing that we're trying to do, which is very hard in India, is taking a data-driven approach to evaluating outcomes. And the main reason behind this is that the Indian education system measures inputs. So if you ask people how many children are in school, they can tell you that. If you ask them how many teachers are, they can tell you that. But if you ask, how many children across, say, even the Mumbai municipal school system, how are the children doing? There's no answer to that because there's no measurement of that as of now. So to the extent that we can, we're trying to work with our partners. And I guess another point with that is because the partners have not been asked to measure outcomes so far, there's very little outcomes measurement that happens. So now we're trying to say, okay, look, if we are working with you, then let's take a data-driven approach to figuring out our outcomes. And then I think the final point is that all of this we really believe needs to lead to systemic change, which means how do you affect government policy. So Amitabh had talked about public-private partnerships, and so when we were involved in Mumbai is the first municipality in India that's drafted a public policy law that's passed. Actually, there's the state of Gujarat has also passed one, but what we were finding was that there were various municipalities, states that were creating these public-private partnerships, and but there was no vision for it nationally. There was no vision for it even on a local basis. And so what we find is that it's these public-private partnerships, which I think in the states would be the equivalent of the charter schools. There's an interest in them, but there's no vision for a systemic approach to it. So I think the other thing that so what we're trying to do is to say, both on a local level as well as on a national level, how do we connect whatever we're doing in terms of investments in organizations to larger policy outcomes. So I'll stop there for now, and we can discuss more.
People to speak here to talk about the investment on education. And one from Better Education, NGO based in Shanghai. We are focused on provide financial education to children and young people in China. And we did this done this for 4 years now. And the approach of our organization to change the education in China is to focus on a small program, small curriculum, to try to make some changes there. Because China, is a very big country with a very strong and solid education system. It's very difficult to change. It's controlled by the central government, and the next level is the provincial level of government, and the city level. The 3 levels system of education. It's very difficult to change overall, but we want to make small change, try to scale up in the country. So the key of our program is to change the teachers. So my topic is invest on teachers, benefit the future better. So when we see the education change on investment on education, we do not in the past 10 years or 2 years, the most investment on education in China is the hard investment. That means invest on buildings, equipments. Now even the central government have to start to change a little bit on soft investment. That means invest on the teachers, the teacher training. But as for when we talk about the soft investment on education, I calculate three parts. Is methodologies refinements, that means the curriculum, the methodology, the teaching methodology. The next part is the teacher improvement, and last is the policy change. It's a systematic change of the education, but our education only on the teacher improvement. But teacher improvement is not only just train the teacher. If you want the teacher to change, it's very difficult because teacher usually is it's very difficult to change. It's very difficult to change the teacher. Especially when teacher taught as a teacher to be more than 10 years, they have some teaching habit. They have the habit to treat with the children. So it's very difficult to change them, and we have no motivation. It's very difficult to motivate them to change because we have not so much funding. Even the government do not have so much funding for the motivation for the teacher to change their way of the teaching. So, according to our experience, if we want to change teacher, we have 4 points to work together. First, we should find some teacher, he or she himself want to change. So he have to learn by himself. He's refine himself. There's something he have some intention to change, to learn. Another one, we have given some very specific workshops to teach them new skills. Another one is give some peer learning. We set up some network for the teachers to let them learn by themselves, within themselves. And another one maybe we give them a mentor to help them to change. And also we set up some teacher networking. For example, let the teachers to visit each other and gathering quarterly or yearly. So if the 5 factors work together, we can increase the successful rate of the changing of teachers. So this is our experience. I want to explain this by example of one of our programs. It's Aflatun program. Aflatun program is an international program we implemented in China. It's a social and financial education for kids. I try to see something from what we worked in the past 3 years. We saw the return from the investment on the teachers. Every year we supply many teacher workshop to teachers. It's Aflatun workshop. According to our experience, only 20% of the trained teachers will take action after the workshop. So you can see from the calculations in 2009, there are 21% of the trainees will take action after the workshop. To 2012, only 15%. From another experience, because the audience, the amount of the trainees increased altogether, so the percentage decreased. But averagely speaking, 20% of the trainees will take action after the workshop or after some support to them. So that link to our calculation of the investment on teacher. For example, we supply $10,000 investment to a teacher workshop, and also the support to the teachers in 1 year. It's 10,000. For example, 40 groups of the teacher. This is our calculation from our data. It's for 40 teachers for 1 year, we supply $10,000 to help them to change. They're only 20%. That means only 8 teachers will take action. We're ready to go with us to deliver some Aflatun program to their students. That means the teacher's head cost will be $1,250 per year. Then, for each teacher, they will maybe deliver the lessons to 60 students from one class or two class or one and a half class. Averagely, it's a 60 students will benefit from the program for 1 year. Then we calculate in this way, the 480 students will benefit from $10,000. That means student head cost will be 20 something per year. So it's a good, it's a number we calculate from what are we doing in China for the Aflatun program. For what? So we invest, averagely invest $20 for students per year. For what? It is very difficult to say. But from the evaluation of the program, we can say 50% of the students will start to save, to make some monthly budget. And 70% of the students start to make some plan to spend wisely. Actually, they improve their financial behavior. And even 1% or 100% of students experience happy learning from the program. And they learn to speak in the public, they learn how to discuss in the group, they experience very new learning habits from our program. This is very different happen in the old environment of the public school. So this is returns, the social returns from the program, and we haven't found a way to calculate the return in dollars for this kind of the social return. So I just say it is enough for the investment for $20 for each student a year. Maybe we will try to find a system to calculate the social return from this kind of the calculation. Maybe we will done with the testing. When you invest $1 to some students, how many dollars will get after 1 year? So, so this is our approach to in China. Our trial to make some changes in China from very small curriculum to make big changes. Our approach is we focus on some curriculum, and we try to train the trainers, train the teachers, change the teachers to find out those teachers really want to make changes for their teaching, for their career. For those teachers, we help them, support them to make happen in their classroom, to help the students to get very good experience of learning, to help the students to improve their capacity for their life, for their life, not only for the examination. And also we work with the local government to make some policy change, to promote the local government to include our curriculum to be the regional-based curriculum, so the government can scale the program in that region. We success after 4 years. We succeed in Pudong area. The Pudong government, the Pudong Education Bureau, already include our curriculum to be one of their 3 regional-based curriculum, and also they supply some funding for the program. So the change of the education is very slow. It's step by step. It takes time to make change, especially the large-scale changes of education in China. So this is our approach. We want to do something in a very careful way to change teachers. Only one small step to calculate the return, calculate the investment. Then we want to scale in the large scale, the large scope. So this is my sharing with you.
I think we're doing okay on time. About 20 minutes. Yeah. So before I kind of open it up to the floor for questions, I just wanted to come back to, I think, something that Kristen had spoken of earlier this morning. Specifically around, I think you mentioned an example about the 10 odd schools or the night schools that you referred to this morning and how they're influencing government. The question I really want to make here, and I think you alluded to it a little bit in your talk, but if you can stress on it a little bit more, you know, the role of venture philanthropy or you know, sort of small private capital coming into the fray really should be a larger game than sometimes it is. You know, Kristen has got varied experience in working in multiple countries and with multiple organizations. I guess the question that I have for you is then, how can we ensure that a greater percentage of this investment is leading to systemic change? You know, the example specifically that came to my mind where you said that the government doesn't want it, but it's a great model. What happens? You know, that's a great investment, it's a fantastic model, it's proven results, it's working and it's affordable, but the government wants to shut its eyes to it. What do you do then? I mean, and maybe the follow-up question to that is there potentially a cross-border opportunity maybe that's worth looking at? So, you know, I go back to the PISA results where Shanghai scored #1, and embarrassingly so, India scored 73 out of the 74 countries that participated in that study. I'd really be keen to understand if there's a learning that could take place so that next time around India doesn't feature so poorly. You know, I think it's purely the mentality of the Indian government to say, you know what, PISA doesn't apply to us because this is not what we teach our kids. And that's a fairly shameful response. So
so the example that I mentioned earlier was a group called Masum, and so they started off in with $2,000. Now they've gone to 14 projects, and their goal is to take that to 4 additional states, or to go to 40 schools over the next couple of years. And as I mentioned before, like the goal is to get government to adopt this innovation. So that what's typical in India is that night schools for children who work are just poor quality, not given the kind of attention, or even have the standards that are debatable for quality in regular schools don't even apply. And their learning is that government is resistant to adopting this because of the eventual. I think the goal is that eventually it would take more money than India is willing to spend in order to bring all of the night schools up to this standard. So they are looking for private capital. I think to your question, that's the story. The question is, now what do you do about it? One of the things that I did mention in my earlier remarks about kind of how we support our grantee organizations is in the capacity building. Advocacy capacity is a part of that puzzle. And so really enabling the groups that we support to be effective advocates for change. And this is in particular because we work in so many countries. Our organization will never be an effective advocate for change in 62 countries. Local people are absolutely the right advocates for change, but equipping them with that skill set, bringing them together with others, and so all of our India grantees, and I want to get them together with yours, are, they get together on a regular basis, and one of the things they talk about is how do we move this needle collectively? And so kind of every ring of our work is about deepening the capacity, ultimately to make that case. Now, in the case of, I can't say what the success probability is in Masum making that case for government. I do think that there's two things that it has in its advantage. One is, when you have a global funder and you've got increasing visibility, what you can do is go outside of that local environment and make a lot of noise about what you know, about what's working, about who's already invested in you. And shame is a powerful motivator, right? And so it's, look what we've been able to do. All these other people are funding us. Shame on you for not funding us as well. And so I think that there is, the more you strengthen their capacity to do that and aid in that, I mean, that's one of the forms of leverage that we're able to provide. And the other form of leverage is obviously introductions to other funding sources on the private side until government gets its act together and decides to invest in it. And so making those introductions and trying to make that possible is the other way that we can support it. But ultimately, in every government, in every place we work, we're also working with groups on hukou reform, right? And so all of the work, we could do all sorts of things in China. It's vast. We support 11 organizations. Most of them are all focused in regions where there is this problem of migration. And we chose that issue, those grantees, because we can bring them together, cast the spotlight, show what change looks like, and try to get something bigger underway.
Great. Thank you, Christian. I'd like to open it up to the floor, so if we can take maybe 3 or 4 questions at a time. We do have about 15 more minutes. Maybe we can just pass this mic around.
My name is Isa from Drilldowns, China. Actually, my question is, when you talk about the impact of the impact of the education and children program, it is unavoidable to be challenged by the sponsor. What are the effectiveness of the program? That is, even you could say, okay, the students get very good response to the program. They do have a lot of growth. However, it is very difficult to really track what is the linkage between your education and to their behavior change in the later of their life. So I would like to ask all of the panelists to give us some of the recommendations, suggestions on this. And the second question actually is relevant because all of the foundation and sponsors tend to limit some of the sponsorship into certain years, for example, 1 or 2 years, and in certain program. However, when you talk about the impact of the education, it is, how to say, it is a kind of dynamic because usually education needs long-term investment so that it can create impact. So how do you view this kind of phenomenon? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you can just pass the mic on. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm Simo from Engage Nepal. It's a bit related about systematic change. It's for Christian. I just want to know if you ever consider to support not civil society organization but the government. Because I mean, we've been always think about how civil society organization can link up with the government, and we know how difficult it is because. To be true, I mean, we know that donors or partners always take a shortcut when they approach and support the civil society organization because we know how difficult, how challenging it is to work with the government. And whatever India, Nepal, or Bangladesh, local government is very weak, corrupted, so it's much easier to work with civil society organizations. So, do you ever consider to work with the government? Maybe local government very active because there are also there are a lot of corruption, but there are also civil officers who are really engaged and inspiring. Or 2, have you ever support one of your organization in designing a special project to engage the local government? Because I mean, you mentioned advocacy, but advocacy is very difficult, it's very political, it's very frustrating, and it takes years to bring a change. So how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we have one more here. Just pass the mic on.
Thank you. My name is Jim. I live in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and recently I do leadership and management consulting. Recently I've had a lot of people that are working with tribal groups in the mountain areas. And you mentioned a moment ago, Kristen, about developing a new curriculum within the language group. Have you had any experience with doing a bilingual type school or curriculum? Because learning a local language will not empower them to be able to work within the trade language of their region or country. So I'd like to comment on the bilingual education.
Let's just take one more question here.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm running quite a small education project in Beijing. It's been going for about 3 years. We take 30 teachers from 8 different provinces into an international school for a week, and we discuss global curriculum development for future leaders, but with a Chinese angle. There's a Chinese government official at the top. I deal with the foreign sponsorship, and then we bring in bilingual assistants from different MNCs. But I'm really looking for advice on, have you had any successes or breakthrough points where your programs have suddenly improved, and what were you doing to achieve that? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we go to the first couple of questions? So I think the first was a 2-part question. One was the impact on children of the program, so sort of the longitudinal part of it in terms of how do you link your program to the outcomes? And the second bit was, foundations only investing for a short duration, 1 or 2 years, whereas the impact may be 8 years out there. Alan, Azhar, would you like to take this?
Kristen, you should take this.
I was just thinking, should I be
that's
answering
okay.
all of them?
Yeah, I know. I think the question you're asking about tracking outcomes is really, it's a difficult question. Certainly, the people at, there are many people who are looking at this randomized controlled trials to say, this is how it should be done. But I have to say that that's really complicated, and I would venture that most of our grants wouldn't be able to do this without technical assistance. And I think the challenge for us as funders is to say, are we willing to put money into evaluation? Are we willing to not just put the money, but also the time and the effort to get people up to speed? But I think, to my mind, that would be the only way to specifically address the question you were asking about how do you link it to your specific intervention. But there may be people in the room who are much more sophisticated evaluators who can comment on that. If there are any, that'd be great. I think the long-term question is important. I think the way, I mean, we're just a year old, so we haven't dealt with the length of funding yet, but I mean, we've thought about it, and I think that the question is, at what point do you say this is showing enough promise to continue investing in it? And I mean, we are thinking of it as, say, over 3 years. I know you had mentioned a bit longer, but clearly it takes time to transform, and I think we would need to be, take maybe. I mean, maybe you can speak, Kristen, to the time frame over which you evaluate.
Sure. So, on effectiveness and impact, I think there's a couple of things. One is that we try to build the capacity of organizations at the beginning. And so, I think there's a very deliberate practice of working even with small organizations. It is possible. And that's one of the things I try to make sure that I let people know. It is not beyond the capability of small grassroots organizations to really learn and apply concepts of inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. I've seen rooms of our grantees kind of struggle with those concepts, and then an hour later be able to distinguish between them. And I think so embedding that skill set within the groups that you're supporting is a long-term investment, not just for your project, but their ability to apply to their next round of funders is contingent upon somebody giving them that skill. So the way that we've done that is to set up a methodology. We've got something called the Organizational Capacity Index, and if anybody wants it, just come up here and I'm happy to kind of share it with you electronically. We have created a starting menu of program indicators, across all of the schools and the education projects that we've invested in that allow people to start building those metrics that are going to make the most sense given the kind of work that it is that they deliver. And some of them have to do with sibling follow-on, kind of how many people are not just sending their first child, but a second and a third child, or their daughters. What is the rate of language acquisition? Because we do, and I'll come back to that later on, we do a lot of work in not just bilingual, but trilingual education. So looking at those kinds of measures. I think having the discipline to work with organizations to set it up at the beginning is really important. And now that we've worked over 19 years, we're just at the point, it was 500 organizations, of starting to try to aggregate that. We haven't done it yet. I would love in 2 years to be able to come back and say, we've looked across and seen, trends and measures, but right now we've got it on the individual organizations that we're investing in. And I think the other thing that's already been said is that the long-term investment really matters, and it depends. It could be 3 years or 2 years or 6, but knowing that it's not going to be tomorrow is really important, and that kind of value takes a long time to accrue.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that question a little bit in terms of our experience. We worked with the state government out in the Northeast in India, and it was only a 3-year program which we completed in April of this year. And of course, we were monitoring and evaluating the data, basis which the government decided to take it to scale, which is what they've done. But one of the key principles that we added both in the government memorandum of understanding as well as with our board was specifically the longitudinal tracking of data, which would not necessarily be done by us at our cost, but it would be done by the government through their own existing mechanism, but allow us to audit that data. So we would come in as a random auditor and take a random sample of kids and just authenticate it. We'll see if it works. Krishnan, do you want to take the questions on systemic change, specifically in supporting a government, and then also potentially designing a program through an organization that then works with the government?
Yeah, so I think one of the lessons from this morning is know where you can play and where you choose to operate. So our fund has chosen very specifically to support kind of our lever is the local NGOs. And so we don't invest directly in government. I know there are people that do, and that's kind of their model for change, and it's not ours. I think that our capabilities really lend more towards supporting the NGOs directly. That said, there are several partners that we have invested in that are doing the work of piloting and then distributing their work through government. And it's not, advocacy, as I mentioned before, isn't just, it isn't political all the time. I mean, sometimes advocacy is just making the case and solving a problem on behalf of government. If you can prove that you're going to solve a problem, have longer term impact, and potentially save money, that's a really effective way to get government to kind of say, hey, I want your program. So, again, it's our investment in their ability to put that package together and then sell it to government that we're focused on, but we don't invest in government directly. I don't know.
We are actually just embarking on a project to do exactly that. So there's this survey, the ASER survey that's done in India every year that measures the quality of education. And they are finding that while it gets a lot of national attention, this survey, it doesn't necessarily translate into government action. And part of that is because a lot of the bureaucrats who deal with education don't necessarily understand the survey itself and how it can be used to further their understanding of the education system. So we're just beginning to work with them to develop a program to do exactly what you're saying, is to improve the ability of the government bureaucrats. The general challenge in India, though, is that most people think of trying to affect the bureaucracy at the higher level where you have more decision-making power. Those positions tend to be very transferable, so people are there for 2 or 3 years and then move on to something else. And the people who stay are the people who are more over, but oftentimes they don't have as much decision-making discretion. But they do have a lot of discretion in the way programs are operationalized. So that's the segment that we are focusing on now.
Alan, would you like to add specifically with Aflatun? I saw that it's basically very much a program that's been designed by you, but now trying to get that over to government. How has that process been for you, and what is the strategy specifically handing over to government for full-scale adoption movement?
Yeah. In the beginning, it's very difficult to invite government to work with us because they're very cautious. Actually, in China, they do not pay attention to the NGOs' work. So we just, in the beginning, we work with the principals. We try to get the friendship of the friends of the principal friends to train the teachers free. We provide free teachers training workshops to schools and let the teachers do the job very well. So try to persuade them to ask the officials of the government to come to see our results, etc. This is one way. But another way is another 2 things. Another way is we organize some conference, very specific conference to invite experts from universities to try to see our program, to speak for us. Is another way. And as we're talking about the government, actually the government is composed by the officials, by the people in the government. So if we want to government change to help us, maybe you can change some of officials. If you get the right official, you can make the change. So that's our way to make some changes in some local government. Yeah.
I think we got 2 questions and we've got 2 minutes left. Perfect. So I think one was on the bilingual school curriculum. If there's any experience that any of you have specifically on that, and then if there are any successes or breakthroughs on any of our programs that we could advise you on, I guess.
So in terms of bilingual education in India, actually, it's an interesting thing because there's huge parental demand for English education. But many of the governments have been slow to respond to it, and they continue to provide local language instruction. And so parents are actually choosing to opt out of the government system now and move into the private system, which is offering English education. But actually, what I was going to say, I mean, some of the tribal areas that we visited to see what's happening in India, the challenge is not bilingual, the challenge is almost quadrilingual education. Because the government system will deliver, say, education in Hindi, so the children may not even speak formal Hindi but a dialect of Hindi, and then but their first language is actually their tribal language, which is unconnected to Hindi. And then on top of that, the market for jobs is in English. So it's but you know the interesting thing is there hasn't been much research done on this within the Indian context, for instance. So I know there's a lot of research around bilingual education internationally and globally, I think particularly out of the States. But we've been struck by the fact that in such a language-rich environment as India, there is very little research that's being done. But there are organizations in India I'd be happy to connect you to.
And the only thing I'd add is that, you know, there's two things. One is that there is a fair amount of research, and what I'm familiar with originates out of Europe, about mother tongue instruction. And so, you know, the ability to offer that to recognize that as a legitimate form of education is really important. So a lot of the groups that we support are rooted there. Then there's the home language, whatever that is, it may be Thai or Hindi, and then education in English. And so our most successful programs that are working in indigenous areas are delivering all three. And again, these are small bootstrap kind of programs to start with, but they've recognized that as core to it. So, you know, to the extent that those are environments in which any of you work, you know, language is really an important factor. And to the breakthrough question, I think that there's there's a lot of research, and I think just a lot of understanding that offering English, you know, for whatever reason, it is the language that adds commercial value to education, and it adds great potential for employability. And so that as a kind of a breakthrough addition to most education programs is significant. The other thing that's significant in a lot of parts of the world, I don't know how true it is in Asia, is something as simple as adding a girls' bathroom. So the story that you know, a lot of people have told me is that for whatever the moderate amount of money is that enables a girl to have privacy, that enables her to be safe, is the difference. And then there's you know, all sorts of things that have to do with sanitary conditions for girls during menstruation. But sometimes it's the simplest things that are the barriers that can be overcome at very low price points. And so again, local context and knowing people that know that that's a problem allow you to spend $50 and solve it.
Thank you very much for being a wonderful participatory audience. If you can join me in thanking the panelists.